Okay, so welcome to the Bristol Fundraising Group April event. We are delighted to be joined by Berkeley Wilde, Director of the Diversity Trust. He will take us through how we can encourage our fundraising to be more diverse, equitable, and inclusive. So I'm going to hand over to Berkeley, who will say a little bit more about himself, and then start on his talk. And then when he's finished, there will be plenty of time for questions. So please do pop any ideas in the chat, and I'm sure this will stimulate an interesting dialogue. Thank you very much. Over to you, Berkeley.
Thanks, Emma. That's lovely. And thank you for the introduction. Yeah, as you've already said, my name's Berkeley Wilde. I use he, him, his pronouns, and I am the Chief Executive of the Diversity Trust, which is a community interest company that I set up back in 2012. And I actually am originally from Bristol. Bristol is my hometown, but I've lived many different places, and I currently have landed in northeast Scotland, where I find home at the moment. But I've got a big connection, and as Emma's mentioned, we do quite a lot of work in the region, particularly in the West of England region. But our offer around the work that we do around training consultancy, which is the core of our business, is national. So we work across UK, but also a bit internationally as well. So as you'll see on the screen, the title of my talk is If I Don't See Myself. The reason I like this title is it was at an event that I was at with the prison service many years ago, where a young person was on the stage and was talking about their feeling and their experience of being included or excluded. And they just said those words, those kind of five simple words, and it really resonated with me. It was something that kind of really made me think about what inclusion means. So I often talk about it, and I will go into a little bit more detail as I go through the talk this morning with you. So just a little bit of information about the presentation. We use what is called a Creative Commons license. So all of the images that you see will have a link in the slide deck, and there's a credit to that. So we have permission to use those images. I've already shared with Emma the slide deck. You're very welcome to access that yourself. And please do make use of the materials. The only request that we have under the license is that if you use the materials, you give a credit either to us or to the original source material. And there will be definitely time for questions at the end. So a bit about the Diversity Trust. We are very much a values-driven organisation. We're a non-profit. It's a core value of ours. We were established in 2012, and the majority of the work that we do is around training consultancy and also research. We are an equalities-led organisation, and what that means for us is that everyone brings their lived experience into the organisation. That's something that's really core value. And we don't add EDI onto our training offer. It's absolutely integral. It's central to what we do. So equality, diversity, equity, inclusion is streamlined and mainstream throughout everything we do. We work across all sectors, so not only in the voluntary and community sector, but we also work in the private sector and in the public sector. We have quite a lot of kind of academic institutions as clients, leading universities. We work a lot with the NHS in health. And also in the private sector, we work with some global corporations, including kind of media corporations. So large and small. We try to make sure that everything that we talk about, we share, we publish, we teach around is really evidence-based and researched and robust in that approach. That's something that we want to kind of like take really seriously, and our work is kind of integrated and ingrained within that research context. And we're also very much about working collaboratively and in partnership. We have a lot of partnerships. You may know an organisation that we do a lot of work with, SARI, Stand Against Racism and Inequality. They're one of our partner organisations, for example. We also do quite a lot of work, particularly in the Avon and Somerset area with the police, for example, and a lot with the NHS there. So a snapshot of some of the team. This is taken from one of our recent impact reports. So kind of like give you a bit of a flavour of who's around. We have a core team of just under 20 staff, and then we have around 30 to 40 consultants that work with us on an ad hoc basis. And we also have around a dozen volunteers that work in our community groups as well. So I want to talk this morning with you about why I think it's important that we focus on equality, diversity, and inclusion. Like, what does it mean? Why do we do it? And I want to offer a few thoughts and ideas, and I really welcome hearing yours later. So I think when you think about this contemporarily, it's very, there's a lot going on around equality, diversity, equity, inclusion all the time. We've got very recent examples of the Supreme Court judgment last year around the protected characteristic of sex. So it's very live, and it's something that affects all of us. And within organizations, I would argue that it is about taking a best practice approach. It has value in it. It has value in being good for the organization, for the culture of the organization, for the organization's health and well-being. Because if we're recognizing and acknowledging people's diversity and difference, if we're celebrating those differences, we are then, in a sense, including people rather than excluding people. So we're kind of bringing people in, bringing people along with us on the journey. So it's good for business. It's a good business case. It's a strong business case. And I know from work I've done around grant applications recently, for example, they are looking for, increasingly, they're looking for more evidence around how you're engaging with diverse communities. That's something that I think is really good from a kind of an ethical point of view. And it's also about reflecting the communities that we work with, that we're a part of, the communities we're based within geographically and physically, and about the communities that we're working with and we're serving. So it's about creating a good practice approach to an ethical approach to practice and to business. And it's also good for people's well-being in relation to their recruitment and retention as well. So it's good for bringing people in. And we're generating and creating the next generation of leaders, aren't we? And we're kind of building people up, and I think if you look at a lot of the staff in my organization are from kind of Gen Z and millennial. And one of the things that they say attracts them to the organization is how much we value and how much emphasis we put on diversity and inclusion. And I know that the generations that are coming through now are seeking out organizations that they want to go and work with who share those values with them. So that's something that's really important. And it's also the law. We have a legal framework such as the Equalities Act of 2010, for example. So it's good for everyone. It's good for business, it's good for people, it's good for family, friends, and the wider community, which we're all a part of. I really like this quote from Jaheen Davis. So equality, diversity, inclusion isn't a list of actions. It is culture. It is how our services function. It is how we welcome everybody into our services. It is a way of doing something. It is the constant reflection, challenging and having sometimes very uncomfortable discussions and conversations. It is testing yourself and your own belief systems, which brings insight, but also brings discomfort. So I really like the idea there of actually, I'm okay to be uncomfortable. I'm okay to feel that discomfort. I'm okay to be challenged or challenging. And it's about how we offer that and how we work with that and how we create a culture in an organization that actually enables those conversations to take place, enables that change to happen. Change is challenging of itself. And when you're talking about culture change, it's something that I think will I remember cases back in my early career, particularly with police and social services, for example, where people would say, I can't stand the way the culture of the organization is changing because it was becoming a more equitable, more diverse, more inclusive organization. And it would actually mean people would leave their roles. And that, for me, is about the fact that actually, yes, organizations will and are changing. There's a constant evolution. We're not static, we're not stuck. And it's about embracing that change and seeing that in a positive way. This was an infographic that was shared on on social media a while ago by a Canadian poet called Praveen Kumar from Toronto, which I really like, which I thought it kind of sums up really well, this idea of like the commitment that companies have to diversity, and then the reality of that diversity in terms of the level that you see across the organization and the different levels, different hierarchies. And we've done quite a lot of work, particularly in the NHS, for example, where they've looked at different levels and tiers within the system, and they've recognized that actually there's very few middle managers from Black minority and ethnic minorities. And so they've done quite a lot of work around mentoring and reverse mentoring to try and kind of like, to address that and to challenge that. So it's kind of like a really interesting way of thinking, taking that approach. This is a very famous infographic meme that you probably would have seen previously. And it just kind of sums up, I think, the differences between what equality, equity, diversity and inclusion actually are. So it's about, making adjustments to make things a bit more equitable. It's about taking barriers away, and ultimately it's about including people, about bringing people into the in this context into the game, as you can see there. So that's the kind of the purpose of that. I also like this one. This one for me really resonated because it was this idea that actually in the center of the equality, diversity, equity, inclusion is this idea of belonging. And, if we can create an organization where thoughts and ideas and perspectives of everybody, they matter, and that we recognize multiple identities within the organization are represented, and that we're constantly and consistently recognizing and redistributing power, that actually that can have this effect within the Venn diagram of an organization that engages the full potential of the individual, where innovation is thriving and views, beliefs, and values are integrated. And it's challenging, but it is worth the journey. It's worth doing. To get that sense of, I feel like I can be my whole self here. I feel like I can belong here. I feel like I'm authentic, that I can be myself in that space. And that sense of belonging is something that I think is really important within organizations to consider. Because accessibility is being able to get in the building, diversity is getting invited to the table, inclusion is having a voice at the table, but belonging is having your voice heard at the table. And certainly over the 30 years of my career, I've really noticed how I've gone from literally being, an activist out on the streets, shut out in the cold, through being invited into the organization, to actually having a seat at the table. And then now people are listening and they're hearing, and that shift over that period of time, I think, has happened. I think that's true for many equalities issues and for many people that are working in the field. Not for everybody, and there is still a lot of work to do and a long way to go, but I think we're getting there. And the great thing is that equality is not like pie. So, if I bake a pie and I'm going to share that pie around, unfortunately, if there are like 8 of us and there are only 6 slices of pie, we're going to run out of pie. We're not going to be able to feed everybody. Equality isn't like that. So it doesn't mean that if I have rights, that my equal rights, they're not going to mean that you have fewer rights. So it's not the same as pie. It's different to that, which is another way of kind of thinking about it. Although there is obviously the interplay between different protected groups. For example, there's a lot of interplay at the right now between religion and belief and sexual orientation and gender reassignment, for example. So there's this historical and contextual and contemporary interplay and interrelationship between different protected groups. But ultimately, having equal rights doesn't take other equal rights away from others. So this came about because I was reflecting quite a lot on this notion of what is normal in inverted commas, and this kind of like this image of this kind of family that you kind of constantly see, you're kind of bombarded with in society in many different spaces, and I don't think you really notice it until you become aware of something like this. And so, for example, like when you pick up a magazine, or if you look on a notice board, or if you look on a billboard, or something that really struck me one time was in the Underground, in London Underground, and I saw these adverts. It was for a holiday company, and every single image was of this kind of like traditional white-looking nuclear family, and it was just that idea that what is normal, and if you don't fit into that normality, you don't have that privilege, It makes you feel like you're other, feel like you're different, feel like that you're excluded. And that's where that notion of if I don't see myself, then I don't think you're for me. So representation is really important. It's only part of the story, but it's an important part of the story. It's about having a voice at the table. It's about being able to see myself. It's about feeling that I can belong and that I'm authentic. So it's a multifaceted way in which I can feel like your organization, the work you do is for me. I'm a part of that. And that would apply not only to your volunteers, to your staff, to your trustees. It would apply to everybody right across the board in the organization and the communities that you're serving and working with. Because if I don't see myself, then I don't feel like I belong. And this is an image from a photographer called Chris Buck, who did a very powerful photo series looking at different ways in which belonging could be explained. And you have this sea of faces of black dolls, and this young girl stood in front of them, and she's not seeing herself reflected. And obviously, this is the opposite of what the reality is. But it's about seeing yourself and making sure that you feel that you're represented, that you belong. And that's so important because that's something that plays on us through our entire life journey. It's around us all the time. It's everywhere we look. It's our entire lived experience. And that's really valuable and important because also you can't be what you can't see. So, the idea of role models is vitally important. It's so important that we can be able to see ourselves potentially in different situations, in different roles, in leadership positions, which is why that the NHS example I gave to you earlier around mentoring and reverse mentoring was so powerful because it was about acknowledging that within the system there was bias, there was institutional racism within the system, and it was about making sure that there were processes and solutions that were set up to try and address that so that people could be what they could see. So often in the discourse around equality and diversity, we have this idea of what used to be called political correctness and has become more recently referred to as the idea of woke. Which was originally the first time you kind of heard it being talked about was in an anthology by Toni Cade Bambara from 1970 called The Black Woman, and comes from Black activism, Black representation and organization. And it's this idea of, in a sense, having empathy, having respect, all of the key elements of belonging that I've been talking about. So in a sense that the kind of the pushback against this, this whole idea, this whole culture is actually pushing back against respect and empathy, which, from my point of view, those are things that are important. I think we should be celebrating them rather than pushing back against them. And you will have seen, and I'm sure you will have heard and read, this kind of like whole dialogue of like, well, why don't we have White History Month and why don't we have International Men's Day? Well, we do have International Men's Day. It's in November, but it only ever gets mentioned in March around International Women's Day, during Pride Month in June. Well, why isn't there a straight pride? It's this idea that a bit like the Sunday sort of all lives matter, white lives matter. It's this idea that, I'm missing out, or I'm not being heard, or I'm not being seen. But actually, the reason all those things exist, the reason we have Black History Month, International Women's Day, and LGBT Pride events, is because those communities have been so affected and so impacted for so long that they haven't had a voice, that they haven't had space within society. When I think back to the Supreme Court ruling last week, there wasn't a single trans individual or a single trans organization that was represented within that case. And yet, there are 6 organizations that were represented from the other perspective. So it's about, you don't have yourself in the space. You're not seen, you're not heard, you're not. So we have to take to the streets. We have to protest. We have to, because we don't have any other recourse to justice. That's the way the system's been set up. Because if I say my house is on fire and you say all houses matter, well, that may be true, but all houses are on fire right now. My house is. Really like this quote from Talib Kweli there, which, is saying that we need to put the focus here because this is what's happening right now. This is why it's important. Yes, of course, all houses matter, but this one's on fire. That's why we need to put our attention and our focus into that. So This is a kind of an infographic about what people think diversity, equity, and inclusion is. So they think, oh, it's about representation. They think it's about training. But actually, it's a lot more complex than that. It's about culture. It is about training, but it's also about policy. It's about managing. It's about leadership. It's about ensuring that we have within organizations employee reference groups or employee resource groups. It's about how we recruit and retain people. It's about what we do in terms of sharing our information about our organization's changing demographics. It's about things like surveys and satisfaction and staff surveys. It's about making sure that we name the microaggressions and the cultural traits within the organization. And it's about making sure that we build diversity right across the whole organization. So it's a much more complex sort of mix, if you like, and that even that is simplifying it. So I really like this idea of moving from fear to learning to growth. So this is an infographic about becoming an anti-racist. And in the fear zone, what I'm doing there is I deny that racism is a problem. I avoid difficult questions. I strive to just be comfortable, to feel comfortable. I talk to others who look and think basically like me, the same as me. Then I might want to move into the learning zone. I might want to do some work around myself. So I recognize that racism is a present and current problem. I seek out questions that make me uncomfortable. I understand my own privileges in ignoring racism, and I educate myself about race and structural racism. I am vulnerable about my own biases and knowledge gaps, and I like to listen to others who think and look differently than me. And then I might want to move into the growth zone. That would be the next stage. So identify how I may acknowledgingly benefit from racism. I promote and advocate for policies and leaders that are anti-racist. I sit with my discomfort. I speak out when I see racism in action. I educate my peers how racism harms our profession and others. I don't let my mistakes deter me from being better. I yield positions of power to those otherwise marginalized, and I surround myself with others who think and look differently than me. So it's really about challenging myself to become more, but to become uncomfortable and to sit with that discomfort and to grow and learn through that process. And I would apply this not only to racism and anti-racism, but you could also apply it to sexism, misogyny, for example. You could apply it to homophobia, transphobia, biphobia, etc. So you could apply it to multiple different characteristics, but this particular model focuses on becoming anti-racist. So some top tips. So diversity training is effective at getting the conversation started, but it's not enough. So systemic bias at each level of the organization must be analyzed and addressed in order to fully understand what's driving bias and how it can be eliminated. So, the conversation is the starting point. It's really important that we start there, but it's not enough. It has to go on from that. So you can't just do a tick box exercise where you've like, oh, okay, well, we've done our DEI training now, we can tick that off. That's, let's move on to the next thing. So it's not just about that. It's about making sure that the workplace culture and policies are informed, robust, best practice, and looked at and scrutinized regularly. So they're not just kind of gathering dust on the shelf. It's about, if it's possible, appointing people into sort of diversity champion roles. It really can help to have in an organization people or a group or somebody that's in that role to actually take that forward as an agenda, but it has to be resourced. It can't be something that's relied upon for people to do in their own time in a voluntary capacity because that can lead to burnout, and that's not fair on the individual or individuals. So it has to be properly resourced. Make sure that you're communicating your diversity and inclusion initiatives. So if you're doing something, make sure you shout about it, share about it, tell people about it, put it out onto media. Think how you will and can attract, retain, and engage diverse communities. So if, for example, I'm looking around a room and I'm seeing a room full of people that all look like me, sound like me, come from the same background as me, what is wrong in the system? Why am I just recreating myself over and over again? Why am I only hiring people that come from the same background than me? That's about me feeling comfortable, but I want to disrupt. I want to change that. I want to actually do something different to that. I want to appoint people who are very different to me, because it makes a good case for diversity. The business case is a good and robust and solid case, and also diversity fuels innovation. Having different perspectives, different thoughts, different views, different opinions, it absolutely will fuel your innovation within organizations. Have thoughtful conversations about diversity and inclusion. And yes, they can be difficult, and acknowledge that. But sometimes sitting with the discomfort, with the uncomfortable, can lead to growth and to change. And what might the future workplace look like? What could it look like in the future? And have a vision of what that could be like and how you will get there, what the journey will be towards that place. Because action has to come from those who have the power. It absolutely has to, because, if we don't show leadership around this, if we don't put out powerful public statements, if we're only interested and only looking at this internally, then nothing will change. The system will completely replicate itself. And we're living in a constant changing, constant state of flux, things that are going on globally at the moment, particularly. It is absolutely at the so important, so critical, that the place in time that we're at the moment, because I've literally just returned from Berlin over the Easter weekend, and I was stood at the Berlin Wall, where there was an exhibition about the Nazis' rise to power in Germany in the 1930s, and reading things that happened in 1932 and 1933 and 1934, and actually I'm seeing things like that are happening today. And it's like, well, what would I have done if I was in 1930s Germany, in 1930s Berlin? What would I have done? How would I have acted differently? And so I think we have an opportunity to think about how we can disrupt and how we can do things differently today. And we should take that opportunity, because I think it's for everyone's sake. So I want to mention what we call cultural competence. And to frame it, I really like this, the quote from Pamela Hayes. Cultural competence is a lifelong project. You have to keep finding ways to expand your learning. So it's not like, oh, I can, do a level 3 course in equality, diversity, inclusion, or I can go on that training course, that day's training, or it's a lifelong journey. It's something that never stops. It's something that we're learning about ourselves and each other and culture and values all the time. It's about interacting with different and diverse communities and groups, sitting with people that are so different to you and your lived experience, listening to them and learning from their life experience. And you can do that through, a variety of different ways. Conferences, events and training, those are useful as well. And make sure that your organization is signed up to the journey, because it's a really important and vital journey. Diversity is about creating a culture where everyone can thrive and can contribute to your organization and understand and serve your increasingly diverse community. So before I finish, I want to gaze into the future. I'm going to hold my crystal ball and look into the future. As we acutely know, rights can be won but also lost. If you look at the Roe v. Wade, for example in the US, around women's healthcare, the global situation that we currently find ourselves in, what's going on around the world, and the tensions and the challenges that are coming out of that, and the effect that that's having upon us here in the UK. Law reform is absolutely still needed, and we should use the law. We should use the legislative framework to address where the challenges are. There's still work to be done around trans rights. There's still work to be done around women's rights. There is so much left to do, and we must all absolutely stay vigilant right now. Okay, I will stop sharing my screen and open up to any questions anyone would like to bring in.
Thank you very much, Berkeley, for that whistle-stop tour of equity, diversity and inclusion issues, and as he rightly says, the business case for it. There is no reason not to be inclusive. I'll kick this off by sort of I think you've given a fantastic business case for why organisations need to be inclusive, need to be diverse, and need to be welcoming and encouraging a sense of belonging for all their stakeholders, their staff, but also presumably that extends to their service users as well. So you might say that, if you're not an inclusive organisation, then your service users aren't going to be that diversity that you're looking for.
Mm.
But this is a fundraisers group. So just thinking sort of extending that into the world of fundraising, what do you think a more equitable fundraising environment could include? I've had sort of some thoughts around what would it look like?
Mm.
Um, what kind of donors are we thinking about?
Mm.
How do trusts and foundations have a role in this? We've seen some that have become like the Tudor Trust, which has done a sort of huge kind of reimagining of its role within the fundraising environment and is now focusing on race, sort of racial justice in particular. And there are a couple of the other big ones like Esme Fairbairn that have done some similar sort of work in that area. But I
Mm.
think we'd probably all agree that sort of most smaller trusts and foundations probably haven't done sort of similar amounts of work. And we often don't see who those decision makers actually are. They're masked.
Mm.
So I guess it's a sort of two-pronged conversation. One is about sort of encouraging diversity and, being an inclusive donor base, but the other one is perhaps, more specific to trusts and foundations. Sorry, that's a bit of a portmanteau, but anyway, something to get the discussion going.
I'll come back first if that's all right. But I really welcome other people's thoughts as well. I think it's a really interesting question around how to become how to diversify because in a sense there for me feels like there has to be a rebalancing because there are some examples as you've given of where organizations, particularly funders, have specified that they want to invest within sort of racial or social justice, which is fantastic. And I know Lottery, for example, has done a lot of work around that. And I think that that's a journey, and I think it has to be one that we all go on. And I think that's something that has to increase because there won't be equity and there won't be social justice without that investment and so the blocks and the barriers have to be taken away. And so if you could do something in a sense almost opposite to that, so almost like akin to positive action, which is completely legal and legitimate within the UK context, whereas positive discrimination isn't. Positive discrimination is different. It's a kind of a phenomenon that was happening in the US, which doesn't happen in the UK. There are some really specific examples of positive discrimination in UK law, which is around things like reasonable adjustments for disabled people, for example. But when you look at positive action, so the example I gave in the NHS of providing mentoring and training and reverse mentoring for colleagues and staff who were on lower tier levels who wanted to move into management, but there were blocks and barriers, and it's about how we identify those blocks and barriers. So in a sense, you have to take that same model and you have to disrupt, and nothing will change if we don't do that disruption. So, it's a journey that we all have to go on. And I think funders have to go on that as well. And grant funders have to go on that journey. And, I absolutely celebrate those funders and those donors who are already thinking that through. And I would welcome more to do the same. I think that's the start of the journey.
So how would you say respond, thinking about sort of, the difference between positive action and positive discrimination to those organisations who are perhaps, may have been funded by Tudor Trust in the past when it was a broader funder and are now looking at a much more narrow focus, one that is, sort of, I mean, funders have been changing their criteria and changing their areas of focus
Mm.
for generations.
Mm.
But I think this one's touched a nerve, possibly because of the the subject matter that they've decided to focus on. So how do you push back against those people who perhaps are feeling, as you say, uncomfortable
Mm.
with the journey that they've been on and the decisions that they've taken in their
Yeah. I think for me, the start of the conversation around equity is that, with positive action, what's happened is you've analysed and you looked at your data and you've recognised and acknowledged where there's a gap, and so you've done that. So you have a robust evidence base to be able to say this is why we are investing in this, whatever that is, and so I can't go into the detail of that example because I don't know enough about it.
No.
But I think from that perspective, where an organization or a funder or whoever has taken evidence and they know that there's a gap, they know that there's something that's missing or a community that's had less resource input into it. So it's about taking that equitable approach. And that's the work that I think has to happen, because if we don't do the work, the system remains the same, nothing ever changes, and discrimination and disadvantage are perpetuated, and generational, and will go on and on and on, and that cycle just continues. So sometimes you have to disrupt, and to disrupt a system can be uncomfortable, and yeah, absolutely. I worked with a group of agencies around things like homelessness, addictions, substance misuse. There are 19 organisations across Bristol, and they talked about this idea of really struggling to recruit from diverse communities. So one of the case study examples that we looked at was in their recruitment practice was actually having, all women shortlisting panels, or people interview who were on the interview panel who were from minority ethnic community background, or having that more diverse representation. And what they discovered was that they appointed from more diverse backgrounds as a result of that. And so it's really simple. So actually, yeah, sometimes disruption and sometimes putting resources into communities that historically have had less investment is going to create equity. It's going to create a sense of combating the injustice, particularly the historical injustice. But I absolutely acknowledge and completely accept that it is challenging, it is difficult, and it's hard to sit with.
Thanks very much. I think it's certainly started to stimulate some thoughts. Alex, can I bring you in here?
Hi, thank you for that, Berkeley. Yeah, kind of talking about recruitment, that's an area where I'd be really interested in looking at how we can create more diversify within my charity, a more diverse fundraising team. And I mean, I know that within fundraising as well, historically, it lacks a lot of diversity within a lot of charities that I know of. Where I work, we have taken steps to try to create the most inclusive environment as we can. So, for example, things would include setting up positions which are encouraged for our service teams to apply for. So to bring people into entry-level positions who might not have fundraising experience, but to try and diversify there. We encourage lived experience with a homelessness charity. All of our CVs and applications are confidential, so we don't have access to names or any of the kind of details like that. And we've got a mixed gender and global majority interview panels, and we must have that. It's mandatory for every interview panel. So we have a set kind of group of people if you can't find an individual that you need to join your panel. I was just wondering, just in terms of other organisations that you've worked with, if you've got any other ideas around how to improve our kind of diversity within recruitment, if there's anything that's worked where you've worked with organisations before.
I think you've given such a comprehensive list, Alex. I don't think I've got much more to add. It sounds like you're doing such brilliant work. Yeah, I mean, I think the only thing maybe to do a bit more work around would be around the lived experience, but it sounds like you're already doing that as well. So honestly, that's so comprehensive. It's fantastic to hear. I'm struggling. I'm struggling to think of anything more. Sorry.
That's all right.
It sounds like you're doing great stuff. Amazing.
Yeah, thanks.
Can I bring you in here too?
Is that me? Sorry, Emma.
Yeah.
I think
I think it's the only mic on the call.
Thanks, Barclay, for the talk. Found that really interesting. I wanted to ask a question because you said something like the action needs to come from the people in power, which I completely understand. But I guess sometimes those people don't have that kind of spark or that initial push to do it. And I guess there's a lot of people in the middle or lower ranks of an organisation, including fundraisers who are often sort of younger, but they're the ones that sort of want to push this, but it can be quite hard with those power dynamics in the organization. So I was just wondering if you had any tips on how, if you want to see change, but you're not someone that can kind of directly bring it about themselves, like what you can do in your organization to agitate for it and help make the case to the people above you.
Yeah, that's a good question, Mike. I think for me, it's about disruption. And I think where I've seen things that have worked is in things like networks and employee reference groups and things like that, where there is some structure and actually you have kind of delegated power or authority within those structures, those networks, those groups, where they can then go to, the senior leadership, chief exec, whoever that is, and actually have a direct line of conversation. So it's about, I think there has to be a sign up from the leadership to actually want to do something different, but they maybe need the support of those networks or those groups to be able to help them advance the agenda. And that has really worked. I've seen that work really, really effectively. I think if you have resistance, other than protest, I don't really know how you're going to overcome that resistance within leadership. I think it's a journey. I think it can take time. I think providing as much evidence as possible. So making sure that when you are taking a case to leadership, that case is really robust, really evidence based. In its approach. And then I think if you're taking that case to leadership, then it might be that there is less resistance and that the door then is more easily to be pushed open. But yeah, I think all of that and more.
Thank you.
Right.
And coming back to thinking about sort of we've just been talking a little bit about sort of internal dynamics within organizations. Just taking that more externally and thinking about sort of how people view us as organizations as likely prospects to give a donation to or to get engaged with as a volunteer. How do you sort of, are there any sort of tips you can think about sort of how organizations can encourage a greater diversity and say that, their donor base, their individual donor base or their service users, their volunteers, the kinds of things that we do as charities that would help to kind of diversify the engagement and bring those voices into, sort of going back to Mike's point, getting those voices kind of pushing in from the outside.
I'm going to give an example of an organisation that I have a lot of respect for. It's called SARSAS, and they're a rape and sexual assault service based in the area there where you're working. And years ago, they started coming to Bristol Pride, for example, and they became very active in social media. Took very sort of strong, powerful, put messages and statements out that were very strong and powerful messages around how they were inclusive as an organization. And I think it's about going into communities. And when you go into communities and start those conversations, that develops a relationship and that then starts to build trust. And that's the starting point, I think, to answer the question. Representation is also part of that conversation, is also part of the answer to that. But it's not enough to do in isolation. The representation has to be also included in the representation, has to be the sort of outreach, inreach, if you like. building relationships with communities, building trust with communities. And, eventually over time, another example I could give you is I've worked with Bristol Drugs Project, for example. They attended those those community events on a small scale. They built up year on year. They have a very much more significant presence now. They've really developed their volunteer base from a very diverse background because they've built that relationship with the communities, and that's how you do all of that. So it's part representation, but also part going out and working, where people are, being where people are, in those spaces, and building those relationships and building trust. I did a program of work over around sort of 6-8 months with Gypsy Roma traveller communities, and part of that work initially was going and sitting in vans, drinking cups of tea, and just getting to know people and building relationships and building trust. And that does take time, but that's the approach that you need to have to go into communities, because it's not because the distance and separation is like us and them. It's othering, whereas what you need to do is to become a part of, and that becoming a part of and building those relationships and building that trust will then mean that you're more likely to bring in more volunteers, and people will access your services from different backgrounds, and you're more likely to get a diversity of donors. So all of that will organically happen because you're building those relationships, building that trust.
Thank you. And that's absolutely, I think and it's certainly sort of, from my experience of working, in a charity. I'm a consultant now, but working in a charity, getting out into communities that we hadn't engaged with before, getting a more diverse faces on our media, on our website, in all our kind of publications. Sort of 10 years on, I think you can really see a difference, and it certainly sort of, I mean, I'm not there anymore, but it feels more inclusive. It looks more inclusive. It looks more encouraging for a more diverse range of people who all have something in common, which is something that's happened to them, no matter what background they've come from. Whether that's sort of gone into their donor base, I couldn't necessarily say, but I think that's maybe the next step is perhaps encouraging it's about sort of getting back to that sort of sense of what is philanthropy, and who is philanthropy for on both sides, who are the donors, but also who are the recipients.
Yeah.
And I think we're sort of I mean, Mike's very good on this. Sorry to draw you into the conversation, Mike. But there's a very tricky power dynamic within that kind of donation giving, donation receiving environment, and how we diversify that is perhaps something that, well, as you say, is definitely work in progress.
Yeah, 100%. Yes.
I think part of that, Emma, is having the right voices around the table for that conversation. Like, as some people might know, I've done a talk for this group before about ethical fundraising, and I've helped organisations develop ethical fundraising policies. And even organisations that have some diversity within them, it's so easy for it still to be like the board of trustees who are mostly white and mostly male, who sit around and have those conversations and don't have the full perspective. And like, when I've run those sessions where people have brought in service users and the wider staff team and volunteers, people just have a completely different perspective because issues affect them in different ways. So I think having the right people around the table for those discussions, and I guess it's also important. Organisations are a work in progress, aren't they? So not everyone gets there immediately. So you might not have a board immediately that's fully representative, but it's about looking beyond that and looking elsewhere in your organisation, being conscious about, okay, there's a voice missing from this discussion, and we need to find a way to bring that in.
Yeah, it is that's a really important point for me around, who's missing, why they're missing, what are the barriers, and what can you do to mitigate that and overcome that. It's really vital. Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, and it's also, I think there's a tendency within fundraising to look at the sort of the decision makers within the organisation and their networks, and if their networks are just simply sort of self, because the idea is you do a bit of network mapping, you see if there's anyone who has links to high net worth individuals or to, local trusts and foundations. And they tend to be a very sort of, select group. But if you cast your networking, sort of network mapping a little bit wider and bring in perhaps your service user groups, your volunteers, you might find that you've got connections into other forms of giving potential, for example, who may feel that they've got a connection to your cause. So there are any ideas that you might have around sort of, how what kind of messages you'd need to be thinking about if you're starting to, do that, a more diverse kind of network mapping kind of exercise around drawing people into your cause, making that relationship between the cause and the group, the wider group that you're sitting within.
Yeah, I mean, I think the messaging, if it comes from the communities that you're working with, that the way in which the language is framed, actually the message will then land better within those communities. So, if you have already got access to volunteers or fundraisers, or I don't know, you might have a community panel, for example, or something you could set up. And actually work with those people to actually create and develop the message that then gets shared within the communities that you're trying to engage with, because that message will land a lot better because it's coming from the community, it's within the community. So I think that's an approach I would definitely take.
No, that's really interesting. Thanks very much. We're just coming up to the end of our time here. Does anyone else have any questions or comments they'd like to make in relation to this topic? We will be popping it onto our YouTube channel later on, so there'll be plenty of other opportunities to go back and have another look and have another think. So please do keep engaging with this topic. It's always work in progress, as we've heard so eloquently today. So if no one else has got any further comments, I'm sorry it's not been as big an audience, but I suspect some people are still on holiday after the bank holiday. So I'll just wrap up by saying we have, first of all, a huge thanks to Berkeley for his contribution today. He's been a fantastic guest to have, very responsive. But also to say our next session is on May the 22nd, 10 till 11 again, and we'll be talking about fundraising and mental health with a friend of ours called Cassie Edmonston. So do jump over onto our social media to find out more information about that, and we look forward to seeing you next time. And finally, just a quick reminder that you will be getting a feedback form tomorrow, probably. So please do fill it in and let us know what you think, but also let us know any ideas you have for future sessions. And a final, again, another big thanks to Berkeley before we sign off for the day. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thanks, everybody.